Belinda was probably cooking breakfast or had got everything ready for breakfast.
Yeah.
They'd nipped to get the milk and they were seen heading towards the campsite.
But then unfortunately, the sighting of Richard and David in the copper convenience store was actually the last time any of them were seen again.
Just a quick disclaimer, the content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, crime scenes and other disturbing material. Listener discretion is advised. This episode is sponsored by Think Forensic.
Think Forensic are a one-stop shop for all things forensic science and crime solving. They hold experience days, as well as corporate events, team building events, and general education for primary school right the way up to university level, as well as other events and consultancy. There's also a shop where you can get your hands on all things crime solving, from evidence gathering to packaging and collecting evidence, as well as other forensic science equipment.
For more information or to book on an experience day, please visit the website. Hi everyone and welcome back to episode 9 of the Grave Secrets podcast. We're your hosts, I'm Annie.
And I'm Beth. So today we've got another case study for you.
Yeah.
We really enjoy covering these cases, but we do get quite stressed out in advance.
It's a lot of pressure.
It is.
I feel like it's you want to do the victims justice and we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to get things right.
Yeah. So effectively, before we film, it's a whole day of revision, which is the way it should be.
Yeah.
But yeah, just so you know.
So we were that stressed out today that we've just done nearly 15 minutes and forgot to turn the camera on. So this is take 20 because we did a few sound checks before what we did wrong. So we do like to get it right, and I think we're both quite perfectionists, aren't we?
Yeah.
And that sort of portrays over in our case studies. But I do quite like that we're quite particular, and I like to make sure everything's backed up with the relevant research.
Yes, and I think that's why with all of our cases, you may have noticed that our episodes are quite long, especially the case studies.
Yeah.
But I think that's why. It's because we go into the background and the detail.
And it's hard to cut them down.
Yeah, which is important. Like, I think that's the biggest section.
Yeah.
That's the most important.
We like to focus on the victims and give a background on the victims' families. And I quite like that bit of it because it gives you more of an insight, doesn't it, of what these people were like. It's not just giving you a name and saying, oh, this happened.
Yeah.
You're actually getting a full insight into the lives before this went on.
Yeah, it gives you more context, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So the case study today is a family case. So there are going to be disclaimers kind of as we go because much like the Pottery Cottage Murders, there is, in this case, 2 children involved. Yeah. And funnily enough, when I was doing the research, this case that we're about to talk about, the Cowden Family Murders, actually took place just a couple of years prior to the Pottery Cottage Murders.
That's really weird with them being so far away and the similarities in the cases, but they are literally opposite sides of the world.
Yeah, so this case takes place in Oregon in the USA. And again, some more context. The reason that we've picked the case is because we've been reviewing our stats, which we get very excited about.
We love our stats.
And we've mentioned in a few episodes now that we're very excited that we've got international listeners. So we had a little look at the breakdown of where our American listeners are, and we found that quite a few were from the Oregon type area. So we thought we'd pick a case study based on that location.
So not only have we hit the US recently, which the US is our second...
largest following.
Yeah, second largest following other than obviously the UK. We've also got listeners now in Dubai and Australia.
Yeah.
So
all over the place.
It's crazy, isn't it? To think that people listen to us from all over the world, and I wonder if they can actually understand us properly with our Yorkshire accents.
And we're just in a little room in Brick House.
Yeah. So on the case, like Beth just said, some parts are quite sensitive with children being involved. So we are going to give you disclaimers as we go through. So if you want to skip the more in-depth details on what happened to the children, we will tell you to skip ahead 30 seconds or a minute so you can skip that out.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're going to start as we always do, with the background to the family. Again, this is the Cowden Family Murders. It's a case that took place in Oregon, USA, and it's actually a case which is still unsolved to this day. Okay, so in terms of what we know about the Cowden family, or as much as I could find, we know that they were quite a close-knit family. Again, when we talk about this family, Richard was the father.
Yeah.
He was 27 at the time, and he was a logging truck driver.
They were quite a young family, weren't they?
Yes, they were. So he was 27, but then his wife, Belinda, was actually only 22 at the time.
Yeah.
But we've managed to work out that they must have been together for quite a few years, because they had a son together whose name was David, and he was 5.
Yeah, so she must have given birth around 17 years old, so they must have been together probably before that.
Yeah.
And they were married as well, weren't they?
Yes, they were, yeah.
Yeah.
So there was Richard and Belinda. They then had David, their eldest son, and then David had a younger sister who was called Melissa. And Melissa was actually only 5 months old at this time.
Yeah.
So yeah, quite a young family. And then they also had a basset hound named Droopy, which
so
I thought
cute,
was adorable. And we do actually, I've managed to find some photos of the Cowden family. So again, we'll put those on social media and stuff.
Yeah, I like that when you can see what the family look like. I feel like it's more personal.
Because they did, again, from the photos, I found a photo of them round a picnic bench when obviously they were camping.
Yeah.
But they did seem quite close-knit, and from what we know, they really liked the outdoors and they tried to get out and about as much as possible.
Yeah, they were a very outdoorsy family, weren't they? And I read something where Belinda had said she were really looking forward to getting out on these camping trips now that the youngest, Melissa, was 5 months. I know, obviously still quite young, but she was more aware, not like a newborn anymore.
Yes.
And they were looking forward to getting out into, the open and going hiking as a full family.
So we're going to be talking about this camping trip that they went on. The only other bit of background information that I managed to find, which obviously becomes more apparent later when they're looking into the family. But they did have a bit of debt.
Okay.
But I think that must have been more kind of credit card debt than anything.
Nothing substantial.
No, because it said that Richard was making more than enough to support his family.
Yeah.
And also that there wasn't any late payments or any missing payments on anything.
Okay, so they were keeping up.
Yeah. But that was the only other thing I could find. That, and then the fact that wider family, they were quite close to Belinda's mother because she lived quite nearby in the area.
Yeah.
So if we talk about the camping trip now.
Okay. So on Labor Day weekend in 1974 is when the family set off on their camping trip. And just for our non-US listeners who might not know what Labor Day is, I mean, I'd heard of it, but I didn't know the background.
No, I kind of just thought it was like a bank holiday that we have.
So Labor Day is an annual celebration in the US, and it is sort of like celebrating the hard work of all the workers and giving them a well-deserved day off. So it actually falls on the first Monday in September. So it is sort of like a bank holiday, like long bank holiday weekend, I'm guessing. And with it being something like that, you would probably want to get away, wouldn't you, with the family and spend time together?
Well, funnily enough, they'd not actually planned to go away, had they?
No.
Because it looks, or it appears that Richard was quite hands-on and outdoorsy, but he was actually putting, or meant to be putting down new gravel for a driveway at their house. And he had got himself all geared up to spend the weekend doing the new driveway, but the truck that he was actually using to decant the gravel had broken. So he must have then said to Belinda, well, we've effectively got a free weekend now.
It's a sign. If your truck's broke down, it's a sign that you're meant to go and do something else,
let's
isn't
go
it?
out, let's spend the time with the family, and let's go on a camping trip, which is what they then did. So their house, they lived in...
it was... White City.
White City.
Yeah,
There's
White
so many
City
place
in Oregon.
names. So they lived in White City, and then they travelled up in his Ford pickup truck to the Siskiyou have I pronounced that right?
Siskiyou, I think it
Siskiyou,
is. Yeah.
Mountains, and they were actually staying in Carnaby Creek. I keep wanting to say Cranberry, but it's Carnaby Creek.
I think Cranberry sounds better. Imagine
And the
going
place
Cranberry
looks-
Creek on the holiday.
I know, and the place looks so nice as well. It looks like it could be. But they stayed in Carnaby Creek, which is effectively in Copper, Oregon, but then it links via this stream, like an estuary, into Applegate Lake. So they were on the cusp of this big lake.
I think what would probably make this easier for our UK listeners is if we find a map and pop that in on the YouTube video, then you can get a bit of an idea of the area. Because when we cover the cases in the UK, a lot of them are small towns or villages where you can easily like grasp where things happen. But this one, there's quite a lot of reference points roundabout, isn't there? So
yeah, there is.
We'll try and find...
Because it's like Oregon, and then you've got Copper in Oregon, and then they've got the Siskiyou Mountains.
I think it's quite confusing.
And then within that, you've got Carnaby Creek.
Yeah.
And then that links to this Applegate Lake, which is the kind of the bigger area around. So yeah, a picture will probably help you.
Let's get a map up there. It's even confusing just listening to us saying it back, isn't it?
But they weren't unfamiliar with the area at all, because again, it wasn't too far of a drive for them. But actually, Belinda's mother lived really close. It was something.
It's like 1.6 kilometres.
Away.
So
So
close.
it was right on her mother's doorstep. So she was obviously familiar with the area. And they'd actually agreed, again, to make the most of the weekend, that what they would do is on the way back from their camping trip, they would go to Belinda's mother's house and then they would have dinner with
Makes
the family.
sense, doesn't it? Do like a round trip and see everyone.
Yeah.
Take the kids. So they seem like quite a close-knit family in general, not just them as sort of the parents and the kids.
Yeah.
The wider family as well seemed quite close.
So if we talk about September the 1st, so that was the Sunday. So they'd obviously had, I don't know whether they went on the Friday or the Saturday.
They went on the 30th.
Right.
But I don't know what that would work out at, because that'd be like 2 days before, wouldn't it? So I feel like they would have probably gone for like the long weekend.
So they'd had a couple of days on the camping trip. And then on the Sunday the 1st, Richard must have got up and said to David, let's walk to the local shop, which again was in Copper.
Yeah, the Copper General Store.
Yeah. And they had gone to get some milk. So they'd just gone for like a couple of the essentials. And they were seen in the convenience store about 9 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, about 9 a.m. And when they left there, it said they were heading back towards the area of the campsite. So nothing really unusual there. You know, Belinda was probably cooking breakfast or had got everything ready for breakfast.
Yeah.
They'd nipped to get the milk. And they were seen heading towards the campsite.
Yes. But then unfortunately, the sighting of Richard and David in the Copper convenience store was actually the last time any of them were seen again.
Yeah, it's just so sad, isn't it, to just think they just disappeared.
Yeah, and they were just going about, quite obviously, just a normal
day. Yeah. So the alarm was actually raised by Belinda's mother when the family didn't turn up to dinner. And you would get, if the family were quite punctual anyway, you'd think if they weren't there on time, you'd probably give them like 15, 20 minutes. And then you'd start thinking, oh God, where are they? And, as a parent, a lot of things would go through your mind, like if they, had a crash on the way.
Yeah, or the kid's okay.
The kid's okay, if they got lost, has something happened. So Belinda's mom actually went to the campsite to see where they were, and I think she was just hoping maybe they'd just lost track of time or thought we'll stay an extra day on the camping trip.
Because again, in those big national parks, you're probably not getting a lot of phone signal. In those kind of areas, in the mountains and stuff.
So this might be a stupid question, but we're in the 70s. Did they even have...
Oh yeah, I'd not actually thought about that. Yeah.
So you wouldn't have a way to contact. You'd probably have to walk to the general store to get to the phone box to then contact someone.
Yeah. So it makes sense that she would have gone to actually
It's not like she could just ring them. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
So she got there and there was no sign of Belinda, no sign of the rest of the family, but there were just oddities around. And at first, I think seeing these things would have probably made her feel more comfortable.
Yeah.
So there was actually Richard's truck parked up.
Yep.
That was still there. So then she probably did think that they just lost
Felt
track
a bit
of
of
time.
relief, yeah.
Yeah. And then there was the half empty carton of milk on the picnic table.
From the morning, yeah.
Yeah. The car keys, they were there.
So the milk on the table showed that they made it back from the store.
Yes.
And they probably ate breakfast.
Yeah.
And they used the milk for the breakfast or
Yeah.
for the lunch. Because this is later on in the day now. And when they're looking at a time when they could have disappeared, it obviously wasn't on the way back from the shop.
But then certain things were odd. So there was Belinda's purse on the table. There was the nappy bag for Melissa.
Yep.
So again, that was kind of odd because it was like, well, if they had have just gone for a swim or something,
Yeah.
you would still need to take the nappy bag, and she'd have probably taken a bag.
And there was Richard's watch as well, and they were
his
saying it was
wallet.
fairly quite an expensive watch for back then.
Yeah.
So you would have, even if you'd have gone down for a swim, you probably would have taken them and put the valuables then in the nappy bag to then go for the swim, wouldn't you? And kept them close by.
Yeah. And again, we mention potentially going for a swim because when they looked in the truck, they could see that all of their clothing was in there, as if they'd kind of packed the clothing up, but they couldn't see any swimming costumes. So that's why they thought that they might have gone then for a swim.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense.
But she then waited for an hour or so for them to maybe walk back from wherever they'd gone, but they just never appeared. And that's when she said, right, something isn't right here.
Yeah, it was a little bit, it's sort of a little bit eerie, isn't it? That all that stuff's still there and that everything's left exactly how the family left
as
it.
if they've just gone in
disappeared.
a flash.
Yeah.
So at that point, she then rang the local authorities.
Yeah, the police in general I don't think took it as serious immediately because there is no sign of a struggle, there was no sign of any violence, the family just weren't there.
So I think prior to that, when she rang up initially, when she described the scene, they thought that it was odd. So they all went out straight away. But then when there was no signs of a struggle or anything, then they kind of chilled out a bit and thought,
because you need evidence, don't you? You need evidence that something has happened because with it looking like the family had just maybe upped and left.
Yeah. So I think it was taken seriously in terms of she's rung up and said there's potentially 4 people missing.
Including children.
So it was the sheriff that went out, as well as some state troopers, as well as Oregon State Police.
Right.
And they all went out initially, so took it seriously from that perspective. But then, like you say, when they got to the scene, they were like, oh, well, there's no signs of a struggle and things haven't been stolen. So therefore, we're probably all right.
Yeah, because with the valuables still being there, it rules out a robbery as well. But one of the police officers did say that the scene was very creepy.
Yeah,
or very,
spooky.
I can't remember what it's spooky, yeah. So it's sort of like they knew deep down something wasn't quite right, didn't they? But there was just no evidence.
No evidence, and then the search, you would kind of think that maybe they'd just gone off and maybe they were lost, but it's not as imminent a threat.
Yeah, gone hiking and got lost. But then again, if you'd gone hiking and you've left the campsite, again, you would take your valuables probably. Purse.
Yeah,
you'd have your watch on, you'd take
and it's
your
just
wallet.
For me, it was the nappy bag.
Yeah.
Like for Melissa,
You
if you've got a
need that.
5-month-old, you don't go anywhere without stuff.
Yeah.
You just need your stuff, don't you?
Yeah. So the only thing we've got really from the 2nd of September, which is the day after, is the family pet Droopy was found at the Copper General store where the family had been the day before, and he was found scratching at the door.
Yeah.
So we don't know if he went along with the family the day before, and that's how he knew his way.
Yeah, I was trying to look to see whether or not Richard had taken Droopy and David, because it would make sense that he would need a walk in the morning.
So you'd do it anyway, wouldn't you? Yeah.
So I was trying to look whether or not Droopy already kind of knew the route because they'd gone and done it the day before. But there was no evidence. It was just the fact that that's the store that they specifically had gone to.
See, I thought with that one, maybe with dogs having like a instinct and the sense of smell that they've got, could the dog have smelled the scent of the family members, and when they weren't there, the dog has then followed the scent, and it's followed it back to that general store where they were. But then you'd think, well, did the dog not pick up the scent of when they left the campsite? And sort of followed them out there instead. So I don't really know, but I think the dog could have picked up some sort of scent.
But again, at this point they were like, right, okay, there's no way the family would have left. Even if the family were going to effectively do a runner and start afresh somewhere else, they would have taken Droopy with them.
You take the dog,
So at that point they were like, right, okay, something's definitely wrong. And the search then continued. So in terms of the search, it's said to be one of the largest in Oregon history. Just because, well, we'll talk about it, but not only the manpower, but also the resources and the area that was covered. Because as we've already mentioned, it was a big area that they needed to search.
So there was assistance from the local and the state police and multiple volunteers. There was rock climbers, there was scuba divers. Over 300 people participated in the search. Like, that is a huge amount of people, including the volunteers as well. So you'd think that they'd be covering not like a ridiculous amount of ground, but with 300 people, you'd think quite a lot would be covered. In general.
So there was the local police force. Then there was, because again, in America, it's completely different, like, setup, isn't it? So there's the local police force. So that would have been like the sheriff that we mentioned and his officers. Then there was state police. Then there was Explorer Scouts. Which again, I'm assuming are a bit like mountaineering. Like a bit like our scouts, but probably more equipped.
I was going to say more equipped.
And then there was the US Forestry Service.
So all these have come together, haven't they, really, which is quite nice. All these different areas have all got different expertise, and they've all come together, because in the UK, I feel like we just have one police for the area, don't we? One police force for the area, so you don't have the local, the state, and you have some people who specialise, don't you? But I don't think we've
still
got
within
like,
the same.
We've got
service.
like search and recovery people, but not like forestry people.
I guess there's mountain rescue.
Which
but
would
again,
be
they're very specifically mountain based. You wouldn't get them in or I wouldn't have thought. So then in terms of resource, they also had planes that were going out, helicopters that were going out, and they were using the infrared cameras. So they were looking for any trace of the family. Again, they didn't pick up anything, but they managed to cover 25 miles of not only the roads, but also the trails that the family may have taken.
Such a huge area. They actually had the dogs out as well, trying to pick up scents going up and around
again,
the
because
mountains.
they'd got the possessions there, like they'd got something for the dogs to reference in terms of scent. But there was just no potential evidence found elsewhere, and there was just no further trace of the family.
The police did quite a lot of interviewing and speaking to people around the campsite. So they actually interviewed over 150 people, which is a lot to say at the campsite. When we're sort of picturing this, I imagine it being like a quiet campsite, very serene, no one around. But for 150 people to be somewhere around, there must have been, it must have been quite busy.
Which makes people disappearing into thin air even more
harder.
Baffling.
And there was actually a $2,000 reward offered in exchange for information. So that would be about just over £12,000 in today's money. So that's a very substantial reward for information.
But unfortunately, despite this massive, large search, they didn't find any potential evidence. And so by September the 7th, so we were talking about the 1st and the 2nd, now we're at September 7th, and the official search was then suspended because they'd just not found anything. And obviously it's expensive. It's so incredibly expensive. And there would have been other cases that were ongoing at the time as well. But the Cowden family continued to search. as well as family and other families and friends.
They were very determined, and the volunteers, a lot of them stayed on to help, didn't they, and continue.
And then volunteers that had just heard about what was going on, they all continued to search. Like if they had holiday free, if it was a weekend, any time effectively that they had, they were still going out to search.
Also, 200 people wrote to the senator to get the FBI to look at the case.
Right.
But there was it was denied due to lack of evidence again.
Okay, yeah.
So the FBI couldn't even come in because there wasn't anything really to go on
to suggest
at this point.
Yeah. So if we go to some theories, because again, you're not working from a lot at this point, are you?
So the main one that stood out to me is that there were 8 disappearances of women in that area, right?
Around that time.
Yeah. So the police looked at possible links of these, but then later, those 8 women were later linked to the serial killer Ted Bundy.
Right, okay.
So that could rule out the connection between those. And even though it was people that had been missing, these were 8 women. This is a family, so I feel like it was a little bit different, but the police still looked into it to see if there was any link
to rule
there.
it out. Yeah. Again, because the evidence was minimal, they didn't think, like we've mentioned, that they'd voluntarily disappeared.
Yeah.
Because you would have taken things. And
the
again,
dog.
we mentioned, and your dog. And again, we mentioned that they had a bit of debt, but again, it just wasn't significant enough for the police to think that it would have been a motive.
Yeah.
And again, if they were close to family, they might have even said, like, we need some help rather than
run away.
Yeah, just start afresh. And again, it'd be very difficult to start afresh with a 5-month-old. 5-month-old?
A 5-year-old and a 5-month-old, yeah.
So they didn't think that it was that the family had just disappeared of their own free will, but then nor did it appear that it was a robbery gone wrong or a robbery at all, because like we said, there was the evidence at the scene, like the wallet and the expensive watch and even the truck, the keys were still there, so they could have just taken that, but there hadn't been. So then they had to think further as to what might have happened, and they actually, because they didn't have any swimming costumes or anything found at the scene at the campsite, they actually then did search the creek as well, and they didn't find any evidence to suggest that they'd accidentally drowned in the creek.
I think that is the most logical thing to go towards. Swimming costumes are missing, which means they've been for a swim.
Yeah.
So you'd go to the nearest bit of water and look there, see where it's like, where it ends up, where you'd wash down to if anything would have happened.
Yeah.
And the scuba divers were even searching underwater there as well. And nothing, like not even one bit of evidence.
No. So odd. So then in terms of other theories, they were kind of baffled. They had no idea what had happened at this point. And it amazes me the amount of cases in America in these more secluded areas, these vast spaces, how many disappearances there actually are that just never get solved. I was listening to one the other day, and it was a child that had basically, his elder brother had left him to go somewhere that they were meant to
stay together.
Stay together. The older brother was like, well, no, I'm not waiting with you. I can go and do this. Turned round, and his younger brother, who was like 3 or 4, was just gone. And the only theory, we're going off on a tangent here, I'm sorry, but the only theory they had for that is that a large bird of prey had picked him up.
No, that's ridiculous.
Well, that's what I thought, but then they were saying that the bird of prey would have still dropped him somewhere. So they'd have found clothes. Anyway, so there's so many cases that are just a complete
what a crazy theory.
Yeah, I know.
Wow.
But yes, so they weren't too sure. Obviously, the official search had been suspended, but then unfortunately, it was 7 months after the initial disappearance, the family was found.
Yeah. So the breakthrough was on the 12th of April in 1975, and it was actually 2 gold prospectors. And I think gold prospectors are people that just go out and search, aren't they, with the ground, search the ground for gold.
Oh, I was
I'm
imagining
guessing.
like proper panning for gold type people.
I was imagining a bit like a metal detector scanner.
Maybe they do both.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure what they do. When it said gold prospect, I was like, how strange in the mountains, but it must be a thing.
Yeah.
It must actually be a thing in America. And these 2 accidentally discovered human remains in the woods, and this was 11 kilometres away from the campsite.
So I, what's the word? Transferred that into miles.
Oh, right, okay, yeah.
So that's about 7 miles.
Yeah, it's far.
Yeah. So it was Carnaby. They were in the woods near Carnaby Creek. But yeah, came across.
But then you say 7 miles we think is a long way, but if this family were experienced hikers, 7 miles was probably not a lot to them.
No.
To walk.
Yeah.
You know, had they walked already towards that area from the campsite on their hike.
Yeah.
You know, it's so hard to piece together when there's so much of a lack of evidence.
So the pair first came across Richard's body, and that's because there'd been no attempt to hide Richard's body at all. He was actually tied to a tree, but it was actually at the top of like quite a steep hillside that he was found. So tied to a tree, and they suspected it could have been Richard because they'd heard about the disappearances.
Well, it'd be quite advanced.
The body was quite decomposed at that stage, so they weren't actually sure.
And you say like there was nothing done to sort of conceal the body, but no one had obviously been in that area for 7 months.
Yeah,
so
which shows you how big.
Maybe whoever did it thought that they didn't need to conceal the body because it would decompose naturally and no one would be in that area because they obviously didn't expect to.
I've got an interesting point on that though, but we'll come back to it.
Right.
So they found Richard and then inevitably thought, well, that could mean that the rest of his family are somewhere around here.
Or nearby.
Yeah, so searched then around the area and they actually found the other 3 members of the family. So again, we're now going to talk about how the rest of the Cowden family were found. So if you do want to skip ahead, I'd say now's the time to do it. So there was a small cave nearby, and it was actually, the entrance was quite hidden because there'd been big stones effectively put in front of the entrance.
It was concealed.
Yeah. But when they actually looked inside, they could see the bodies then of an adult female, a young child, and an infant. So again, although they're not obviously going to make an identification at that point, they had their suspicions and then obviously called it in and said that they'd suspected that they'd found the Cowden family.
Yeah, it's really sad. They were all found like quite close together, but when we look into the autopsy and how they died, some of them were quite different as well, though, weren't they?
Yeah, so like different ways of having been murdered, but then also I just found it heartbreaking that Richard was kept away from his family.
Yeah.
So that, you know, the other 3 were found together, but he was then.
He was on his own, excluded from it.
Yeah.
So Belinda and David, both in the autopsy results, had died from a .22 caliber gunshot wound, and Melissa had died from severe head trauma. And Richard was a bit of a weird one because even after the autopsy, I still don't think they were 100% sure
couldn't find
on how he died. It was actually undetermined.
But again, like you've just mentioned, because he was out in the elements, that makes sense because he was in a greater state of decomposition than the others would have been, because obviously the cave would have kind of preserved the others to a certain extent.
But then if there was a gunshot wound, you would still have been able to obviously identify something like that, something as extreme. So you just think if someone had the gun with them and they killed the rest of the family, why wouldn't they? Because it's sort of I'm not saying it's an easy way, but it's a quick way if someone wants to do it, isn't it?
But then they did then have to consider the fact that because Richard was found further away, and because they couldn't find a cause of death, that maybe he had actually murdered his own family and then taken his own life.
Yeah.
But there was actually only one bullet found, and there was no gun found near his body. And again, he was tied to a tree. So
I was just going to say, if he's tied up,
yeah. So,
how did he kill the family and then tie himself to the tree after?
Yeah.
And then if he were tied to the tree beforehand, he wouldn't be able to fire the gun.
No.
So that wouldn't make sense. And I think that was ruled out pretty quick. But they do have to look normally at the closest male relatives. It does seem to be, doesn't it? So it makes sense that they did, it did cross the mind.
Yeah. Well, they have to just rule it out, don't they?
Yeah.
Because anything could be a possibility until they have managed to rule it out.
Yeah. Another thing they thought is maybe the Cowden family were killed in another location and then they were brought to this location for the bodies to be left, because when this all came out, the bodies were found in the cave.
Yeah.
A volunteer actually came forward and said, I searched the cave, and there was no bodies in there. So the police said, right, there could be more than one cave around here. So they actually got the volunteer to come back and lead the police officers to the cave, and it was the cave that he searched. So straight after, when the Cowden family went missing and there was the big search going on, the cave where the bodies were found was searched and was empty.
Yeah, so between the 2nd and the 7th, he had searched it and there was nothing in there. And then obviously months later in April, that's when they were found. So that's the point that I was going to say, where, like you've mentioned, it might be that they had been placed there afterwards, but it's unlikely that they were placed there and then didn't think anyone would find them. Otherwise, they would have been there for a longer period of time, but they clearly hadn't been. Yeah,
so they were either still alive when the search was going on, or they'd been killed in a different location and then brought there after the search, because to be fair, that would actually make sense to do if you're trying to get rid of a body or conceal a body. And you don't want someone to come across it, you'd keep an eye on the search team and you'd look at where they have already searched, because they're not going to cover that area again.
No.
So you'd think, where have they already searched? So I think that means it's someone with local knowledge and had knowledge of the search that was going on.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. And because you would, again, with these massive areas that we're talking about, you need local knowledge. You need knowledge of the trails.
Yeah.
You need knowledge of safe places. So if anything does happen, you would know a safe place. So yeah, it does make sense that it would be someone local.
And I think that sort of brings us nicely on to maybe having a look at the suspects. So we've talked about Richard being a suspect in this case, but there was one person in general who stood out, who was called Dwayne Lee Little. He was 25. When he was on parole, when he was 16, he'd raped and murdered a teenager. He'd been in and out of prison for various things along the way. And his family were from the same area. Yeah, so there were a number of reasons that he was kind of implicated, but one of them was because, like you said, they'd conducted a load of interviews with people that were at the campsite, and there were a family from California that were at the campsite, and they said that on that evening of the 1st, I think it was, they'd actually seen a truck pull up, and it had 3 people in, and it looked like 2 men and a woman, and that it was almost as if they were waiting for this family to like move along and get out of the area. They felt very like unnerved, didn't they, by it? It was a really weird situation. It was as if they wanted them to leave, but obviously didn't know any more information. And so when Dwayne Lee Little became a suspect, they actually had evidence to suggest that him in that truck, it might have been him and his parents. Yeah, and it turned out that he had actually been to Copper over Labour Day weekend and around the time of the family's disappearance. Yeah, they could verify that, didn't they? Yeah, because the family had been to stay in a cabin somewhere. Yes. Which was local, and they'd signed the guest book. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. So the police had obviously then gone and looked and seen who signed the guest book, and it was their family. So they know that they were there as a family, and he has had previous for this sort of thing.
Sorry.
Go on.
And then in terms of like further evidence as well, obviously they've got very minimal, but what they did have was the 22. They knew that it had come from a 22 caliber gun.
Yeah.
And when they interviewed Little's girlfriend, she'd actually said that at Christmas time, so this would have been after the killing of the Cowden family, she had actually seen Little with a 22 caliber gun.
She did actually report that to the police at the time, and that's why he went back into prison.
Yes.
So, you know, he'd just been in and out for various things.
Yeah.
A lot of, I think pretty much most of his life. I mean, committing his first crime at 16 was quite a violent crime.
But he'd been paroled in May, so that was 3 months before the September. And then in November, he then actually went on to rape and murder a teenager who was called Orla Faye.
Yeah.
And Orla Faye, they could then prove that he'd been in the copper area, like we've said, and there at the time. But then he'd actually gone on to commit further crimes. So again, if he has killed, again, as a theory, if he has killed the Cowden family, he's seen that one of the largest searches in the history of Oregon has taken place and he's not been caught. It does make sense that he would go on to commit further crimes because now he just thinks he's going to get away with it.
Yeah. In 1980, he actually picked up a pregnant lady whose car had broken down.
Yeah, so this was on the June 2nd.
Yeah, and he violently assaulted her and raped her. Luckily, her and the baby both survived.
Yeah.
And she did give evidence, but after that he was actually sentenced to 3 life sentences, which, you know what, I feel like more could have been done before we get to this point, because he was a reoffender, and
violent reoffender,
and all towards women as well, and young girls. So I feel like it's easy to say, but it depends what evidence, obviously, they had at the time to arrest him. But I always think that the US is sort of harsher than the UK with the sentences. Sort of life, you can get life in the US and life means life, whereas life in the UK is not always is not always life. So in this case, I was quite shocked to see that he was in and out of prison for these short amounts of time, because I thought they'd have been more harsh on that. In general.
I've just apologised to my microphone, so if anyone's paying close attention, then they'll have laughed at that, because I just, sorry.
We'll be able to hear that on the video.
So it was very feasible that Little could have committed the Cowden family murders, but there just wasn't the evidence. So in prison, he wouldn't talk about or discuss any of his offences, would he? So even the ones that he'd actually been convicted of in the past, he still wouldn't talk about.
Which is strange, because his cellmate came forward and said that he had confessed to killing the Cowden family.
Right.
And when obviously the police heard about that, they went in and they started interviewing him, and he went back to saying nothing again. And there was no evidence to prove that, so there was never anything that could be done. There was also false confessions from individuals who were not, what did they used? I think they were receiving psychiatric help.
Right, okay.
And that also hindered the investigation. But Little actually died in prison, so anything that he did know, or if he did do it, he literally took it to the grave.
Yeah. There was another, again, potential avenue that they had to explore, because a few months after the death of the Cowden family, Richard's father actually committed suicide, which, again, you can completely understand would be through not being able to deal with the grief of the loss of his son.
And his grandchildren.
But that then has to be investigated in terms of, is it a guilty conscience? Like, has he done something to his own family and then he can't live with that guilt? But when they actually looked into that, there was no evidence or no reason to suggest that that's what had happened.
It must be horrible as a family member to be looked into and be investigated for the death of your loved ones. And I know it's what they have to do to rule them out. But you just feel awful,
Horrendous.
wouldn't you?
Yeah.
You feel absolutely awful that people think that you could have done that.
I know.
To your family in general.
So in terms of the family now, I mean, obviously families consistently live in hope. Families of any unsolved case will always live in hope that even if it's not a positive outcome, they get answers.
Yeah.
It's the answers that they're looking for. But again, unfortunately, in this case, it is very unlikely that any new evidence would come to light as far as it being a cold case.
Yeah.
Because of where the bodies were found, where the crime had taken place.
Yeah, and the area where the crimes happened in 1980, the area was actually flooded to create a lake. So that means that there will be no cold case because there's no area to investigate anymore.
No.
Which is also sad again for the family because like you are hopeful, but you know now that there's no chance of getting any piece of evidence.
No, or just closure.
Yeah.
In terms of the theory of what may have happened, because obviously it seems unusual, like how do you get 4 people under your control to do as you say?
If it's one person that's done it, it's difficult, isn't it, to control 4?
But the one piece of evidence that they did have was the bullet, and that would suggest that maybe if he had grabbed Belinda or one of the children and then held a gun to them, then obviously if your family are under imminent danger, you are going to do as that perpetrator says. So if they say, we're going this way and we're going to hike up this hill, you would do it.
And just to cross it back over to the Pottery Cottage case, Billy Hughes controlled 4 adults and a child.
Yes.
And he didn't have a gun. He had, obviously, an axe.
Yeah.
So it does make you think a weapon could have been involved in this. But unfortunately, 40 years on, and this is still an unsolved case.
So yes, we will post the pictures of the family, again, just so that we highlight that the reason we're telling this story is to give them a small bit of, it's not even justice, just an awareness of what happened to this family. But hopefully we've covered it in enough detail and you've enjoyed today's episode.
Yeah. So we hope our American listeners have enjoyed this because this one was just for you. And we hope we pronounced everything right as well. There was a few things where we came across them and I thought, oh, am I even saying this right? I know sometimes when I listen to the American podcasters covering one of our cases and
Peterborough.
Yeah, or there was one the other day and they were covering something in Chesterfield and it was just so funny the way that things were said and I thought this is going to be us. People are going to be saying, what are they saying that like that for? So if we have pronounced anything wrong or any areas wrong, we apologise, but it's probably just our accents. Yeah.
And in terms of future episodes, again, we're going to continue to cover case studies. So if you do have any cases that are local to you, if you've heard about any cases that you want us to cover, let us know. We will try and cover cases that are lesser known wherever we can, because again, it gives the victims a bit of a voice.
Yeah.
But if there are any more larger scale cases or cases that you do want us to cover, then yeah, please let us know.
And on next week's episode, we've actually got something quite exciting. So we are looking at the evidence again, and we're going to be talking to you about forensic botany. So if you want to delve a little bit deeper into that, find out what it is, how it helps in investigations, and sort of look at a few different case studies with us, then make sure you join us next week.
And last thing before we go, we've just secured another interview, which we are incredibly excited about.
This is you did a very good job on this one, and I can't take credit because I had nothing to do with securing this interview. It was all Beth to take the credit for this one, but we can't wait for you to hear this one.
Yeah, so again, keep an eye out on socials because we're likely going to be teasing.
We'll do an announcement.
What's coming up. But thank you ever so much again for watching, listening, following, and take care because we've now reached 10,000 views.
10,000 views on YouTube, which is crazy. So make sure you're following us over there. Even if you don't watch us on YouTube, just give us a little follow just to be supportive. Don't forget to leave us a review. Our reviews are going up all the time. We've got quite a few 5-star reviews now, which is
Fabulous.
Perfect. Yeah, so make sure you're following us on all our socials, and we will see you next week.
Take care.
Bye.